Case 1, Melissa Lucio. February 15, 2007. Cameron County, Texas. To understand what happened inside that small home in Harlingen, you first have to understand who Melissa Lucio was before that day. She was a mother of 14 children, a woman who had spent decades navigating poverty, addiction, and a childhood marked by abuse she never fully escaped. By her own account, and by the accounts of family members who later testified on her behalf, Lucio had endured sexual abuse starting in her own childhood and had lived through years of domestic violence in her adult relationships. She was, in the words of one mitigation specialist who later reviewed her case, a woman who had learned from an early age that survival meant compliance, that when someone in a position of power pushed hard enough, the safest response was to give them what they wanted to hear. That history would become central to understanding what happened next. But on the afternoon of February 15, 2007, none of it had been introduced into evidence yet. All that mattered to the responding officers was that a 2-year-old girl named Mariah Alvarez would not wake up from a nap, and that paramedics arriving at the home found her unresponsive. Efforts to revive her failed. Mariah did not survive. Grief has a way of looking suspicious to people trained to look for guilt. Within 2 hours of Mariah's passing, 2 hours in which a mother had just watched her daughter's life end, Cameron County detectives brought Lucio into an interrogation room. What followed was not a brief round of questioning to establish a timeline. It was an interrogation that stretched past 5 hours, conducted while Lucio was in a state of acute shock and exhaustion, according to footage later reviewed by legal experts and documentary filmmakers. Throughout that interrogation, Lucio denied harming her daughter. She said so, according to the record, more than 80 times, sometimes verbally, sometimes by shaking her head when words failed her. Investigators did not accept those denials. They pressed harder. They implied, according to later analysis of the footage, that cooperation was the only path to going home, that admitting something, anything, would end the ordeal. Eventually, after hours of this, an exhausted Lucio said 5 words that would define the rest of her life. "I guess I did it." Those 5 words became the foundation of the state's case. Prosecutors paired them with photographs of bruising across Mariah's body, bruising in various stages of healing, and argued that this was clear evidence of an ongoing pattern of physical abuse. To a jury seeing only that evidence, the picture prosecutors painted seemed coherent. A mother, overwhelmed by 14 children, who had lashed out at the youngest one too many times. But there was another version of events, one the jury heard only in part. 2 days before Mariah's death, according to Lucio's family, the toddler had fallen down a steep and poorly lit flight of stairs outside the family's apartment, an accident reportedly witnessed by some of her older siblings. Medical experts consulted by the defense argued that a fall of that nature could account for internal injuries that were later misinterpreted by investigators as signs of deliberate, sustained abuse. The defense wanted to call an expert on false confessions, someone who could explain to the jury why a woman with Lucio's history of trauma and abuse might say, "I guess I did it," under 5 hours of pressure without it meaning what prosecutors claimed it meant. The trial court barred that testimony from being heard during the guilt or innocence phase, a ruling that would haunt the case for years to come. In 2008, a Cameron County jury convicted Lucio of capital murder. She was sentenced to death, becoming the first woman of Latina descent in Texas history to receive that sentence. For more than a decade after her conviction, Lucio's case moved through the appeals system with the slow, grinding pace typical of death penalty litigation in Texas. It might have remained a footnote in legal journals were it not for what happened in the final days before her scheduled execution. As April of 2022 approached, with Lucio's execution set for the 27th of that month, a documentary about her case had already drawn attention from journalists, from a Cornell Law School professor who called the original prosecution by far the weakest capital case she had ever examined, and eventually from a bipartisan coalition of Texas state legislators who took the unusual step of publicly questioning whether an innocent woman was about to be executed. The pressure culminated in an extraordinary last-minute intervention. Only 2 days before Lucio was scheduled to die by lethal injection, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals issued an emergency stay. The court ordered the trial court in Cameron County to conduct a full review of new evidence pointing toward her innocence, evidence that, notably, Even the original prosecutor's office no longer stood firmly behind. The sitting Cameron County District Attorney would later acknowledge that exculpatory evidence had been withheld from Lucio's defense at trial, including records of interviews with Lucio's other children and Child Protective Services documentation that appeared to corroborate her account of Mariah's fall. What followed was a years-long evidentiary process, and it produced findings that stunned even seasoned observers of the Texas justice system. In April of 2024, Judge Arturo Nelson, the very same judge who had presided over Lucio's original 1990-era trial and who had once sentenced her to death, reviewed the newly surfaced evidence and found that prosecutors had illegally suppressed material demonstrating Mariah's injuries were consistent with an accidental fall rather than deliberate abuse. That alone would have been a remarkable reversal. But 6 months later, in October of 2024, Judge Nelson went further still. After reviewing Lucio's remaining claims, he issued a formal finding that Melissa Lucio is actually innocent, that she did not kill her daughter, and he recommended that both her conviction and her death sentence be vacated entirely. That recommendation now sits before the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, the only body in the state with the authority to formally overturn a criminal conviction. And here is where Lucio's story, unlike so many true crime narratives that end in tidy resolution, remains unresolved. As of this year, more than 2 full years after Judge Nelson's recommendation was filed, the Court of Criminal Appeals has still not ruled. Every Thursday morning, when the court publishes its rulings online, Lucio's family, her legal team at the Innocence Project, and supporters around the country check the docket, hoping to see her name. Every Thursday, so far, they have been disappointed. Lucio remains incarcerated at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, neither freed nor executed, suspended in a legal limbo that her son John Lucio has described as its own quiet form of punishment. "We just want to see my mother free," he has said publicly. "She should never have been convicted. She should never have faced execution." If the Court of Criminal Appeals ultimately adopts Judge Nelson's findings, Lucio would become the first woman in the history of Texas's death row to be exonerated, a milestone that legal scholars say would send shockwaves through how the state handles capital convictions built on confessions extracted during lengthy, high-pressure interrogations following the sudden death of a child. Her case has already reshaped conversations far beyond the walls of any courtroom. It has become a touchstone for reform advocates studying coerced confessions, for psychologists studying the specific vulnerabilities of trauma survivors under interrogation, and for lawmakers, Republicans and Democrats alike, who have cited her case while pushing for changes to how Texas law enforcement questions grieving parents in the immediate aftermath of a child's death. Whatever the Court of Criminal Appeals ultimately decides, Melissa Lucio's 17 years on death row have already become one of the most studied cautionary tales in the modern history of American capital punishment. If this case has affected you, or if you or someone you know has experienced the loss of a child or the trauma of domestic violence, organizations like Child Help's National Child Abuse Hotline provide free, confidential support around the clock, staffed by trained crisis counselors who understand what families in these situations are going through. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 2, Kimberly Cargill. June 18, 2010. Smith County, Texas. Some crimes are crimes of passion, sudden, chaotic, impossible to fully plan. This is not one of those cases. What happened to Cherry Walker in Smith County, Texas, was the product of calculation, of a woman who saw an obstacle standing between her and an outcome she wanted, and who made a deliberate decision to remove that obstacle permanently. To understand the motive, you have to go back to a custody dispute. Kimberly Cargill was locked in a bitter fight with Child Protective Services over the care of her son. It was, by every account, a contentious and high-stakes proceeding, the kind of legal battle where a single piece of testimony can tip the outcome one way or the other. Standing in the middle of it was Cherry Walker, a 39-year-old woman with an intellectual disability who had once worked as a babysitter for Cargill's son. Walker had agreed to testify at an upcoming custody hearing, and whatever she planned to say, Cargill evidently believed it would work against her. Rather than face that testimony in court, Cargill made a choice that would define the rest of both their lives. She lured Walker to her home under circumstances investigators later reconstructed carefully, restrained her, and cut off her air supply until she stopped breathing. Walker's disability, the very vulnerability that had made her a trusted, gentle presence in the lives of children she cared for, made her an easy target for someone determined to silence her. What Cargill did next revealed just how far she was willing to go to avoid detection. She loaded Walker's body into a vehicle and drove to a remote rural road outside town, far from anywhere a passerby might notice. There, she doused the remains in lighter fluid and set them on fire, an act intended not just to eliminate evidence, but to make identification, and therefore justice, as difficult as possible. For a time, it seemed the plan might work. The severity of the fire complicated the medical examiner's efforts to determine cause of death and made formal identification a slow, painstaking process. But fire cannot erase everything, and investigators built a case methodically, piece by piece. Forensic evidence recovered from the scene, cell phone records placing Cargill in the area, and a timeline of Cargill's movements on the day Walker disappeared that repeatedly contradicted her own statements to police. When detectives began questioning Cargill directly, her account of her whereabouts fell apart almost immediately under scrutiny. Inconsistencies piled up. Each version of events she offered contradicted the one before it. By the time the case reached trial, prosecutors had assembled enough physical and circumstantial evidence to leave little doubt in the jury's mind about what had happened and why. A Smith County jury did not take long to reach its verdict. In 2012, Cargill was convicted of capital murder. The jury's sentencing decision was equally swift and equally unambiguous: death. Cargill became the first woman to receive a death sentence in Texas that decade, an unusual enough occurrence in a state where death sentences for women are exceedingly rare, and where at any given time only a handful of women occupy the state's death row at all. The case reverberated far beyond Smith County, drawing particular and sustained attention from disability advocacy organizations across the country. Cherry Walker's intellectual disability, and the fact that she had been specifically targeted because her testimony threatened to work against Cargill in a custody proceeding, became a devastating case study in how people with disabilities can be uniquely vulnerable to exploitation and violence, how their trust and their perceived credibility as witnesses can make them targets rather than protections. Advocacy groups pointed to Walker's case in subsequent years while pushing for stronger legal protections and clearer reporting requirements for crimes against people with intellectual disabilities. In the years since her conviction, Cargill's case has moved through the Texas appellate system at the deliberate, often glacial pace typical of death penalty litigation. Her legal team has focused much of its effort on claims that her original trial counsel provided ineffective representation during the sentencing phase, the portion of a capital trial where a defendant's life history, mental health, and any mitigating circumstances are presented to the jury before it decides between death and life imprisonment. To date, no court has found sufficient grounds to grant her relief on those claims, and Cargill remains on death row, her appeals continuing to work their way through the system. For Cherry Walker's family, the conviction brought a measure of legal closure, but nothing close to emotional resolution. In interviews given in the years following the trial, family members have described Walker in terms that stand in stark contrast to the calculated brutality of her death, as gentle, trusting, eager to help, the kind of person who saw the best in everyone around her, including, tragically, the woman who would ultimately take her life to protect a custody outcome. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 3, Taylor Parker. October 9th, 2020. Bowie County, Texas. For 10 months, Taylor Parker lived inside a lie so elaborate that even the people closest to her never questioned it. She told her boyfriend she was pregnant. She told her friends. She told her family. She held a gender reveal party, complete with the balloons and cake and photographs that have become a fixture of modern expectant motherhood, all documenting a pregnancy that did not exist. She posted updates on social media tracking a due date that was drawing closer with each passing week, a deadline that existed only inside her own fabrication, but one that was, in its own way, entirely real, because as it approached, Parker needed something she did not have, an actual baby to present as her own. She found her target close to home. Reagan Simmons Hancock was 21 years old, a young wife and mother from New Boston, Texas, 36 weeks into her second pregnancy. She and Parker were not strangers passing on the street. They knew each other personally. Parker had even photographed Reagan's wedding, standing behind a camera to capture one of the happiest days of Reagan's life. That closeness, that trust, is precisely what made the plan Parker had constructed so devastating and so difficult for investigators, and later for the public, to comprehend. On the morning of October 9, 2020, Parker went to Reagan's home. What followed has been described by investigators, prosecutors, and later by documentary filmmakers as one of the most harrowing crimes in recent Texas history, not simply for its violence, but for the sheer premeditation behind it, the months of deception constructed for the singular purpose of taking another woman's unborn child as her own. Parker attacked Reagan inside her own home. Reagan, 36 weeks pregnant and utterly unprepared for what was happening to her, did not survive the assault. Parker then cut Reagan's unborn daughter directly from her body. The infant, who would later be named Braxton Sage by her grieving family, was found alive a short time later when a Texas state trooper pulled Parker over for speeding and erratic driving near DeKalb, not far from the Oklahoma border. Parker told the trooper she had just given birth on the side of the road. The baby was rushed to a hospital in Idabel, Oklahoma, where medical staff worked to save her. She arrived, according to trial testimony, with a heartbeat, but the trauma proved too severe. Braxton Sage did not survive. Reagan's mother found her daughter's body on the floor of the family's living room. Reagan's 3-year-old daughter was home at the time. The scope of what had been taken from that family, a young mother, her unborn daughter, and the sense of safety a 3-year-old girl might have once had inside her own home, settled over the New Boston community in a way that residents who lived through it still describe as inescapable, even years later. The case shocked investigators not only for the violence involved, but for the extraordinary length and detail of the deception that preceded it. Parker's trial in Bowie County became one of the longest and most heavily attended in the county's modern history. Prosecutors presented testimony from more than 140 witnesses across 25 days of proceedings, an enormous undertaking for any capital trial, reflecting both the complexity of the evidence and the sheer public interest surrounding the case. The defense argued, in one of the trial's most contested legal points, that Braxton Sage had not been alive and breathing independently at the moment of the alleged kidnapping, and that without that element, the capital murder and kidnapping charges connected to the infant's death could not stand. Prosecutors countered with medical testimony establishing that the baby had, in fact, arrived at the hospital with a heartbeat, undercutting the defense's central legal argument. The jury was not persuaded by the defense's position. After deliberating for a little over an hour, a remarkably short deliberation given the scale and complexity of the case presented to them, the Bowie County jury convicted Parker of capital murder. During the sentencing phase, Reagan's mother, Jessica Brooks, addressed Parker directly in the courtroom, delivering a victim impact statement that would later be widely quoted in national coverage of the case. "My baby was alive, still fighting for her baby, when you tore her open and ripped her baby from her stomach in front of her baby girl." Reagan's sister, Emily Simmons, also addressed the court, describing years of being unable to think of her sister without thinking of what had been done to her. The jury deliberated on sentencing for just over an hour before returning with its decision, death. It was November 9, 2022. Presiding Judge John Tidwell had little to say to Parker beyond the formal sentencing itself, instructing deputies afterwards simply, "You can remove her and take her to death row." By 4 o'clock that afternoon, less than 3 hours after the sentence was handed down, Parker was already being processed for transfer to the state prison system in Gatesville. Parker's direct appeals have since run their full course. In November of 2025, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals rejected her first appeal, upholding both her conviction and her sentence. She then sought review from the highest court in the country, filing a petition with the United States Supreme Court in March of 2026, with her legal counsel arguing that she had not received a fair trial in Bowie County. That petition was denied on May 29th of this year, effectively closing off her direct appellate options, though habeas corpus review continues and no execution date has yet been set. Parker is currently held at the Patrick L. O'Daniel unit in Gatesville, one of only 7 women on Texas's death row, a small and closely watched population within the broader capital punishment system. This past summer, the case was reintroduced to a global audience through a documentary titled Maternal Instinct, which premiered on Netflix in June of this year, directed by Jessica Dimmock and produced by Story Syndicate. The documentary revisited both the crime itself and the elaborate deception that preceded it, and its release reignited widespread public conversation, not only about the specifics of Parker's case, but about the broader phenomenon of fabricated pregnancies and the very real safety risks they can pose to expectant mothers who unknowingly find themselves in the orbit of someone constructing that kind of elaborate lie. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 4, Linda Carty. May 16, 2001. Harris County, Texas. Linda Carty's story begins not in Texas, but across an ocean, a detail that would come to shape the entire trajectory of her case in ways few capital cases in American history ever experience. Carty held dual British and American citizenship, and to the outside world, she appeared to be living an unremarkable life in Houston. Behind that ordinary exterior, however, Carty was constructing a lie that would ultimately cost a young mother her life. A fabricated pregnancy, not entirely unlike the deception seen elsewhere on this list, built for the same devastating purpose, to eventually produce a real child as proof of a pregnancy that never existed. Carty settled on 20-year-old Joanna Rodriguez as her target. Rodriguez had given birth just 4 days earlier, and in the earliest, most vulnerable days of new motherhood, sleep-deprived, physically recovering, focused entirely on her newborn, she and her family had little reason to suspect the danger Carty represented. Carty did not act alone. She recruited 3 men to help carry out her plan, a level of coordination that prosecutors would later argue demonstrated significant premeditation, rather than a crime of sudden impulse. The group's method was brutally direct. They stormed Rodriguez's apartment at gunpoint. Rodriguez was overpowered and bound, and in one of the case's most disturbing details, she was placed inside the trunk of a car, left there while the group carried out the remainder of their plan. Rodriguez suffocated inside that trunk. Her newborn was taken from the apartment during the invasion, carried away as the group fled the scene. The investigation that followed produced one small measure of mercy amid the horror. Officers located the infant alive inside a vehicle during the course of their search, and the child was safely returned to surviving family members. Joanna Rodriguez herself was not so fortunate. She was found dead in the trunk where she had been abandoned, a discovery that devastated her family and shocked investigators accustomed to the routine violence of a major city, who nonetheless described the case as being among the most calculated they had encountered. Investigators moved quickly once the scope of the crime became clear, and their case against Carty solidified rapidly through the cooperation of the men she had recruited. Several of them, facing their own potential prosecution, provided detailed statements to investigators that corroborated Rodriguez's family's account of events and directly implicated Carty as the plan's architect. In February of 2002, a Harris County jury convicted Carty of capital murder, and she was sentenced to death. What has made Carty's case unusual within the broader landscape of Texas capital punishment is not the crime itself, disturbing as it was, but the sustained level of international legal attention it has drawn in the decades since her conviction, attention driven almost entirely by her British citizenship. The government of the United Kingdom has formally intervened in her case on multiple occasions over the years, a rare and diplomatically significant step for a foreign government to take on behalf of one of its citizens facing execution in the United States. British officials and legal advocates have repeatedly raised concerns about the quality of legal representation Carty received during her original trial, arguing that critical avenues of defense were left unexplored and have pressed Texas authorities for clemency review on multiple occasions. Despite this sustained diplomatic pressure that has, in other cases involving foreign nationals, occasionally resulted in delayed executions or additional judicial review, Carty's conviction and death sentence have remained firmly in place. She continues to pursue appeals from death row today, her case representing one of the more geopolitically complex capital cases currently active within the Texas court system. A reminder that even in cases where guilt is not seriously contested, questions about the fairness and adequacy of legal representation can extend a case's legal life for decades. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 5, Brittany Holberg. November 13th, 1996. Randall County, Texas. Every death penalty case carries within it a story about how a life arrived at its final, irreversible moment, and Brittany Holberg's story begins long before the night that would define the rest of her life. By the time she was 23 years old, Holberg had already lived through years of severe crack cocaine addiction, a dependency that had come to dominate nearly every decision she made. She had also, according to testimony later presented by her defense team, endured a childhood and adolescence marked by repeated sexual abuse, family instability, and early exposure to illegal drugs, circumstances that mitigation specialists would argue, years later, helped explain how a young woman ended up where she did, without excusing what ultimately happened. 80-year-old A.B. Towery Sr. lived alone in an apartment in southwest Amarillo. He and Holberg were not strangers. According to Holberg's own testimony, Towery had been paying her for sex for several years prior to the night in question, a detail that would become central to how both sides framed the encounter that led to his death. On the night of November 13th, Holberg says she had just been in a minor car accident following 10 days of continuous, heavy drug use. In this state, exhausted, still under the influence, shaken from the accident, she went to the home of a man she had known for years, a former client, seeking somewhere to be. What happened inside that apartment would be reconstructed in 2 starkly different ways at trial. Holberg testified that Towery became enraged after discovering her smoking drugs inside his home. She said he struck her with a frying pan and pulled her by the hair, and that she genuinely feared for her life in the moments that followed, that everything she did next was born out of a desperate, immediate need to survive an attack she had not provoked and could not otherwise escape. In her account, the confrontation escalated rapidly, and in a state of fear and self-preservation, she used whatever was within reach to stop the assault, ultimately using a broken lamp and a knife during the struggle. In total, Towery sustained over 50 wounds, a number that would become one of the most fiercely contested details of the entire case, cited by prosecutors as evidence of intent and rage, and reframed by the defense as evidence of the chaotic, adrenaline-driven nature of a genuine fight for survival. Prosecutors offered the jury a very different narrative. They argued that Holberg had not gone to Towery's apartment merely seeking shelter, but with the specific intention of robbing him to fund her addiction, and that the injuries inflicted went far beyond anything a genuine claim of self-defense could account for. Central to the state's case was testimony from Vicki Kirkpatrick, a woman who had shared a jail cell with Holberg following her arrest. Kirkpatrick told the jury that Holberg had confessed to her during their time together, describing the killing in disturbingly casual terms, testimony that painted Holberg not as a frightened woman defending herself, but as someone who had acted with calculation and, disturbingly, even a degree of enjoyment. After fleeing to Memphis, Tennessee, in the immediate aftermath of the killing, Holberg was arrested there in February of 1997 and extradited back to Texas to face trial. In March of 1998, a Randall County jury convicted her of capital murder in the course of committing robbery, and she was sentenced to death. For more than 2 decades, Holberg's case moved through the standard channels of death penalty appeals, direct appeal to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals in the year 2000, denial of that appeal, a subsequent petition for a writ of habeas corpus in federal court in 2015, and a denial of that petition as well. Notably, even in denying relief, the federal judge who reviewed her case took the unusual step of encouraging the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles and the sitting governor to review Holberg's circumstances and, in his words, afford her the grace and dignity that have been absent from her life to date, a striking acknowledgement, even within a ruling against her, of how much unresolved tragedy sat underneath the case. The true turning point came decades later. In March of 2025, a divided panel of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit issued a ruling that stunned observers of Texas capital litigation. By a 2-to-1 vote, the panel reversed and vacated Holberg's conviction and death sentence entirely. The basis for that ruling centered on a critical piece of information that had never been disclosed to Holberg's defense team or to the jury that convicted her. That Vicky Kirkpatrick, the very witness whose testimony had done so much to undercut Holberg's claim of self-defense, had secretly been working as a paid police informant for the Amarillo Police Department for months before she ever claimed to have spoken with Holberg about the killing. Court records would later reveal that Kirkpatrick had received thousands of dollars in cash payments from police, had assisted officers in executing approximately 40 separate search warrants, and had helped secure multiple unrelated convictions, all while her role as the state's central witness against Holberg remained, in the eyes of the jury, that of a simple, disinterested cellmate coming forward with the truth. The Fifth Circuit panel found that withholding this information violated Holberg's constitutional right to due process under the landmark 1963 Supreme Court case Brady v. Maryland, which requires prosecutors to disclose evidence favorable to a defendant. Writing for the majority, Circuit Judge Patrick E. Higginbotham noted that if Kirkpatrick's status as a paid informant had been disclosed to Holberg's defense and to the jury, there is a reasonable probability that the result of Holberg's proceedings would have been different. In a passage that would be widely quoted in the months that followed, the panel observed that 27 years on death row is a reality dimming the light that ought to attend proceedings where a life is at stake. That victory, however, was far from the end of the story. The state of Texas petitioned for the case to be reheard by the full 17-judge Fifth Circuit, an unusual and rarely granted procedural step known as an en banc rehearing, reserved for cases of exceptional legal significance. In July of 2025, the full court granted that request, a decision that automatically vacated the earlier panel ruling in Holberg's favor and reinstated her original conviction pending the outcome of the new proceedings. The state's position, laid out across extensive briefing, was that Kirkpatrick's testimony had not, in fact, been central to the jury's decision, that overwhelming physical evidence, independent of anything Kirkpatrick said, was more than sufficient to support both the conviction and the death sentence on its own. The full Fifth Circuit heard oral arguments on January 21st of this year, in a rare and closely watched en banc session, one of an unprecedented 7 such full court hearings scheduled in a single sitting, according to court observers, reflecting just how significant a docket the Fifth Circuit was managing at the time. 17 active judges, joined by the senior judge who had authored the original panel opinion, heard just over an hour of arguments from both sides. Holberg's counsel argued that Kirkpatrick's testimony was the only evidence speaking directly to her intent and to any perceived ongoing threat she posed, evidence essential to a jury choosing between life and death. The state countered that the case's overwhelming physical evidence made any error in withholding Kirkpatrick's informant status ultimately harmless to the trial's outcome. As of today, the full Fifth Circuit has not yet issued its ruling. The court has indicated only that it aims to release an opinion generally within 60 days of oral argument, but has offered no further specifics. Holberg's conviction, for now, stands unresolved, neither confirmed nor overturned. A legal limbo that has already stretched on for nearly 30 years since the night in question, and that shows no sign of concluding cleanly in the immediate future. Whatever the court decides, further review is considered likely. If the conviction is reinstated, Holberg's attorneys are expected to seek review from the United States Supreme Court. If it is overturned again, the state may pursue its own further appeal or begin preparing for a new trial. Holberg remains the only person from Amarillo currently housed on Texas's death row, one of just 7 women in the entire state facing that sentence. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 6, Darlie Routier, June 6, 1996. Dallas County, Texas. In the early morning hours in the quiet suburb of Rowlett, Texas, a 911 call came in that would launch one of the most fiercely debated criminal cases in modern Texas history. A case that, nearly 30 years later, still divides prosecutors, forensic experts, documentary filmmakers, and members of the public who have spent decades examining its details. Darlie Routier told the dispatcher that an intruder had broken into her home and attacked her family while they slept in the living room. When officers arrived, they found a scene of devastation. Her 5-year-old son, Damon, and his 6-year-old brother, Devin, had both sustained fatal injuries. Darlie herself had visible wounds to her neck and arm. Injuries, she said, came from fighting off the intruder who had attacked her sons. From the very first hours of the investigation, the case would hinge on a single, unresolved question. Had an outside attacker truly entered that home, or had the violence come from within? Investigators were divided from the outset, and that division would only deepen as the case progressed toward trial. Prosecutors built their case around the theory that the crime scene had been staged to support Darlie's account of an intruder. They pointed to a window screen that had been cut from the outside, arguing that the pattern of the cut was inconsistent with what one would expect from someone breaking in from outdoors. They pointed to a sock discovered down a nearby alleyway, suggesting its position didn't align with the path a fleeing stranger would likely take. And they pointed to Darlie's own injuries, arguing that their relatively superficial nature stood in stark, troubling contrast to the severity of what her sons had endured just feet away. A discrepancy prosecutors argued was difficult to reconcile with a genuine, life-threatening struggle against an outside attacker. The defense pushed back forcefully against every element of that theory. From the very beginning, Darlie's legal team maintained that an unknown intruder was responsible for the attack, and they argued that the original investigation had rushed to judgment, fixing on Darlie as a suspect far too quickly and failing to adequately pursue other leads or preserve the crime scene with the rigor the case demanded. They pointed to the chaos of the initial emergency response, well-meaning paramedics and officers moving through the home, potentially disturbing evidence before it could be properly documented, as a critical failure that undermined confidence in the forensic conclusions prosecutors would later present to the jury. A Dallas County jury ultimately sided with the prosecution's version of events. In February of 1997, Routier was convicted of capital murder in the death of her son Damon, and she was sentenced to death. What sets Routier's case apart from so many others is the sheer, sustained intensity of public scrutiny it has attracted in the years since her conviction. Scrutiny that has not faded with time the way it has for many older capital cases, but has instead grown more organized and more technically sophisticated as forensic science itself has advanced. A dedicated and vocal community of supporters has continued to challenge the original investigation's conclusions for nearly 3 decades now, joined over the years by independent forensic experts, investigative journalists, and documentary filmmakers who have each taken their own pass at re-examining the evidence. Much of that renewed scrutiny has centered on DNA testing that either did not exist or was not sufficiently advanced at the time of the original trial. Appeals courts have granted additional DNA retesting on the case's physical evidence on multiple separate occasions over the years, a level of continued judicial engagement that is itself somewhat unusual for a case this far removed from its original conviction. To date, none of that retesting has produced results sufficient to overturn Routier's conviction, but neither has it fully resolved the questions that have surrounded the case since its earliest days. Prosecutors and their supporters maintain that the original trial's forensic conclusions remain sound and that no new evidence has emerged capable of seriously undermining the jury's verdict. Routier's advocates maintain the opposite, that unresolved forensic questions, combined with what they characterize as significant gaps in how the original crime scene was processed, leave more than reasonable doubt about what truly happened inside that home on the morning of June 6th. Routier remains on death row today, her case still active, still generating new appellate filings, and still after nearly 30 years, unresolved in the eyes of a public that remains split between those convinced of her guilt and those who believe an innocent mother has spent decades paying for a crime someone else committed. Few cases in the history of Texas capital punishment have generated this level of enduring, unresolved public debate. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 7, Erica Sheppard. June 30th, 1993. Harris County, Texas. Marilyn Sage Maurer was 43 years old, a respected real estate agent working in Houston, well known within her professional community and, by every account from those who knew her, well liked by her clients and colleagues alike. She had no way of knowing, on the day her path crossed with Erica Sheppard's, that she was about to become the victim of a robbery that would spiral into a killing that would echo through the Texas court system for more than 3 decades. Sheppard was only 19 years old at the time, a detail that would later become central to how advocates and legal experts came to understand her case, even as it did nothing to change the outcome for Maurer. Sheppard and a male accomplice targeted Maurer specifically to steal her vehicle. What was intended, at least at its outset, as a property crime escalated rapidly and violently. Maurer was ambushed, and in the confrontation that followed, sustained injuries severe enough that she did not survive. Investigators moved quickly once Maurer's stolen vehicle was located, and the evidence trail led directly to Sheppard. By 1995, prosecutors had assembled a case strong enough to bring before a Harris County jury, which convicted Sheppard of capital murder. She was sentenced to death. In the decades since that conviction, Sheppard's case has become something of a touchstone within the broader legal and advocacy community, focused on how childhood trauma shapes the outcomes of capital cases. Extensive mitigation investigations conducted long after her original trial have documented a childhood marked by extreme abuse and profound instability, circumstances that, according to Sheppard's current legal team, were presented only minimally, if at all, to the jury that decided her fate. Her original trial attorneys, operating under different standards and resources than capital defense teams typically have access to today, did not conduct anything close to the kind of thorough life history investigation that has since become standard practice in death penalty cases across the country. That gap between what the jury actually heard and what a fuller investigation later revealed has become the foundation of Sheppard's ongoing appeals. Her legal team has argued, across multiple filings over the years, that a more complete picture of the abuse and trauma she endured throughout her childhood might have led at least one juror to choose life imprisonment over execution, the standard a capital defendant must meet to succeed on this type of appeal. Texas courts, so far, have not been persuaded to grant relief on these grounds, but Sheppard's team continues to press the issue through the appellate process that remains available to her. Sheppard has now spent more than 3 decades on Texas's death row, making her tenure there one of the longest among the state's female death row population, a length of time that itself has become part of the broader conversation among advocates about how long capital cases can remain unresolved, and about what that extended uncertainty means both for the people awaiting execution and for the families of victims like Marilyn Sage Maurer, who have now waited more than 30 years for a case to reach its final conclusion. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 8, Karla Faye Tucker. June 13th, 1983. Harris County, Texas. Few cases in the entire history of Texas capital punishment have generated the kind of sustained, worldwide attention that surrounded Karla Faye Tucker in the final months before her execution. Attention that had far less to do with the facts of her original crime than with what happened to her afterward, inside the walls of death row itself. Tucker was convicted of capital murder in connection with the deaths of 2 people, Jerry Lynn Dean and Deborah Thornton, during the course of a residential burglary, a crime carried out using a pickaxe, one of the most severe weapons ever cited in a Texas capital case. The brutality of the original crime was never seriously in dispute at trial, and a Harris County jury convicted her accordingly, sentencing her to death. What distinguished Tucker's case from the moment of her conviction onward was not the crime itself, but the transformation that followed it. While incarcerated and awaiting the outcome of her appeals, Tucker underwent a religious conversion to Christianity, a conversion that supporters, prison ministers, and even some of her former critics would come to describe as genuine, sustained, and remarkable in its depth. She became an outspoken advocate for prison ministry programs, worked to counsel other incarcerated women, and in a detail that would draw significant media attention in its own right, married a prison chaplain in a ceremony conducted by proxy while she remained behind bars. As her case progressed toward its final resolution, Tucker's conversion and her subsequent advocacy work drew international appeals for clemency from an unusually broad and diverse coalition. Religious leaders across multiple denominations, human rights organizations that do not typically involve themselves in individual American death penalty cases, and members of the general public who had never previously taken any public position on capital punishment but found themselves moved by her story. Even figures within the conservative religious and political communities that most strongly supported the death penalty found themselves publicly wrestling with her case, given the sincerity many perceived in her transformation. None of that outpouring of support ultimately changed the legal outcome. On February 3, 1998, Karla Faye Tucker was executed by lethal injection, becoming the first woman executed in the state of Texas since 1863. A gap of well over a century between female executions in the state, a fact that itself underscored just how rare her case was within the broader history of Texas capital punishment. Her execution ignited a national conversation that has never fully subsided in the decades since. A conversation centered on the fundamental question of what role, if any, genuine rehabilitation and religious or personal transformation should play in a system built around the finality of capital punishment. Legal scholars, theologians, and death penalty policy experts have continued to cite Tucker's case in academic literature and public debate alike, making it one of the most frequently referenced individual execution cases in the modern history of American capital punishment, more than a quarter century after it concluded. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 9, Kimberly McCarthy. July 21, 1997. Dallas County, Texas. Dorothy Booth was 71 years old, a retired college professor living a quiet life in Lancaster, Texas. She and Kimberly McCarthy were neighbors, the kind of ordinary, everyday proximity that exists between countless people living on the same street, largely without incident. That proximity, and the trust it implied, became the exact vulnerability McCarthy exploited on the day she arrived at Booth's door asking to borrow a cup of sugar. It was a simple, almost mundane request, the kind that neighbors have made of one another for generations without a second thought, and it was enough to grant McCarthy entry into Booth's home. Once inside, McCarthy carried out an assault against the elderly woman that investigators would later describe as one of the most disturbing they encountered in their careers, an attack driven by a singular motive: McCarthy's severe crack cocaine addiction. During the assault, McCarthy took Booth's diamond wedding ring, going so far as to remove one of Booth's fingers in the process of taking it, before later selling the ring to fund her drug habit. The theft of a piece of jewelry, driven by the grip of addiction, cost Dorothy Booth her life. A Dallas County jury convicted McCarthy of capital murder, and she was sentenced to death. Her case then moved through more than a decade of appeals, a period during which McCarthy's legal team pursued the full range of post-conviction relief available to capital defendants in Texas, without ultimately securing a reversal of either her conviction or her sentence. McCarthy was executed by lethal injection on June 26, 2013. In the years since, her case has become frequently cited within discussions of how severe addiction can escalate into extreme, often senseless violence directed at the most vulnerable members of a community, elderly neighbors and acquaintances who, precisely because of long-standing familiarity and trust, may be less guarded around people they have known for years. Dorothy Booth's surviving family members have spoken publicly in the years since her death, often emphasizing the importance of communities checking in regularly on elderly neighbors and loved ones living alone, a message they have offered not out of anger alone, but as something constructive they hope might come from an otherwise senseless loss. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 10, Betty Lou Beets. August 6, 1983. Henderson County, Texas. By the time investigators began looking closely into her life, Betty Lou Beets had already been married 5 times, and it was the disappearance of her 5th husband, Jimmy Don Beets, that first drew law enforcement attention to the modest property she called home in Gun Barrel City, Texas. For a time, Beets offered a simple explanation for his absence. He had left her, she said, the way husbands sometimes do, without warning and without a forwarding address. Investigators, acting on a tip that suggested a far darker explanation, began to look more closely. What they found on the property would become one of the most disturbing discoveries in the history of Texas domestic homicide investigations. Beneath an ornamental wishing well in the yard, a small, decorative feature that visitors to the property might have passed by countless times without a second thought, investigators uncovered the remains of Jimmy Don Beets. The motive, prosecutors would later argue at trial, was financial. A $100,000 life insurance policy and a pension that Beets stood to collect once her husband was declared dead, insurance she had allegedly arranged with his passing already planned. But the wishing well was not the only secret the property held. In a discovery that transformed the case from a single, isolated tragedy into something far more disturbing, investigators also located the remains of Beets's 4th husband, Doyle Wayne Barker, buried beneath a nearby shed on the very same plot of land. A second husband, concealed through a second, separate act, hidden on property Beets had continued to occupy in the years between. Prosecutors moved forward with capital murder charges connected to Jimmy Don's death, and Beets was convicted and sentenced to death. Throughout the extensive appeals process that followed, Beets and her legal advocates raised allegations of severe, sustained domestic abuse across multiple marriages, abuse they argued had defined much of her adult life and had shaped, without excusing, the choices she ultimately made. Texas courts reviewing her case were not ultimately persuaded that this history was sufficient grounds for relief from either her conviction or her sentence. Betty Lou Beets was executed by lethal injection on February 24, 2000, becoming one of the relatively few women in modern American history executed for crimes connected to multiple spouses concealed on the same piece of property, a case that remains, more than 2 decades later, a frequently studied example within discussions of domestic violence, financial motive, and the complicated, often unresolved question of how a lifetime of abuse should or should not factor into a capital sentencing decision. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and hit subscribe so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary from Cold Case Hour. 10 women, 10 Texas courtrooms, 10 verdicts that placed each of them among the smallest and most closely watched population in the entire American justice system, the women of Texas's death row. What strikes you most, looking back across all 10 of these cases together, isn't just the violence itself. It's how different the paths to that violence were. A coerced confession extracted from a grieving mother in the hours after unimaginable loss. A calculated act of silence to protect a custody outcome. Months of elaborate deception ending in the theft of a child who could never be replaced. A childhood of abuse that shaped, without excusing, a fatal night decades later. A conversion behind bars that couldn't undo what came before it. A wishing well in a backyard, hiding a secret for years. Some of these cases remain as contested today as they were the day they were decided. Darlie Routier's conviction still generating new appeals and new forensic questions 3 decades later. Brittany Holberg's fate still sitting, unresolved, before a full federal appeals court. Melissa Lucio still waiting, all these years later, for a ruling that could finally set her free or could leave her exactly where she's been for 17 years. Others reached their final, irreversible conclusion long ago, closed chapters that nonetheless continue to shape how the legal system and the public think about addiction, trauma, motive, and justice. What all 10 cases share is this: behind every conviction was a victim who does not get to tell their own story anymore. Mariah Alvarez, Cherry Walker, Reagan Simmons Hancock and her daughter, Braxlyn Sage, Joanna Rodriguez, A.B. Towery Sr. Damon and Devin Routier, Marilyn Sage Maher, Jerry Lynn Dean and Deborah Thornton, Dorothy Booth, Jimmy Don Beets and Doyle Wayne Barker. Their names deserve to be remembered as clearly as the names of the women convicted in their cases, because a story like this isn't really about the person on death row. It's about everyone whose life was cut short before it should have been. If any part of what you've heard today has affected you, whether it touches on domestic violence, the loss of a child, or the trauma that can follow either one, help exists. The National Domestic Violence Hotline and Child Help's National Child Abuse Hotline are both available around the clock, confidentially, staffed by people trained to help. If this documentary kept you watching all the way to the end, that's exactly the kind of story we're committed to bringing you every week here on Cold Case Hour. Carefully researched, respectfully told, and focused on the people these cases too often leave behind. If you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. Leave a comment and let us know which of these 10 cases stayed with you the most. And if you found value in this video, a like goes a long way in helping us bring you the next one. Thank you for spending this time with us. We'll see you in the next case.